Good afternoon, lovely friends. Welcome to another The Artist Forge Live. My name is Nicole York. I will be your host. And today joining me are the wonderful and talented Bassam Sabah and Becca Bjorky. Hi, friends. If you're in the
Hello.
audience today, say hello in the comments. We will grab your comment and share it and say hi to you. Let us know how your weekend was. Bassam and Becca, how are y'all doing?
I'm doing fine. Haven't seen you guys for a while. Sorry, I've been kind of either absent or busy or just life getting in the way, but it's great to see you guys again.
You too. I mean, you've been also like taking care of yourself and doing the vacation
Oh,
thing
yeah,
and
that,
like,
yeah, yeah, except caught bronchitis on vacation, came back home
oh
with
no.
bronchitis, and it's still going on. It's been a couple of weeks now, so it's all good
So it
though.
was bronchitis, huh?
Yeah, it was. Both of us.
Ugh.
Yeah,
Gosh.
so I may cough here and there, but it's getting towards the end, thank God. But yeah, no, it was a great vacation. We went to the Turks and Caicos, just laid out on a beach for 7 days, read books. I did something that I've never done before. Sorry, I'm getting right into it here, which is read 3 books in the same week.
Ooh.
I usually read 3 books in the same decade. Fully read them, not just. But I read 3 books, which I'm very proud of, and it pretty much just rested, towards year end, just before Christmas. Got back on the 23rd and ready to go.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Bobby is here with us too. Hi,
Hey,
Bobby.
Bobby.
So nice to have you with us, friend. Becca, how about you? How are you doing?
I'm chilling. I'm chilling. Your face right now.
I never know whether to believe you or not about your levels of chill because I feel like your levels of chill, if you say I'm chilling, it probably means like I'm doing 50 things on no sleep as opposed to 150 things on no sleep. So,
I went to bed at 10:30 like a normal person, and I slept and I woke up in the morning. I'm like doing
wow.
normal person things today. Yeah, I mean, to be completely candid, I've been kind of going through a mental health roller coaster, and I am on Adderall this week, and everything is really calm. It's very weird. So I am actually chilling at like a normal human level, I think.
I love how you described that, but I like as you were describing it, your eyes were going like this. You're like normal.
Are
Like, am I
you
convincing the other humans that this is human?
are you doing any work through that, or you're just still in holiday mode?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been working. I know I mentioned last week, like, what did I learn over the holidays? Do not schedule any work while my kids are home from school on winter break. So it's been nonstop. Like December was probably that was like the craziest holiday season I think I've ever had in my entire professional experience. Um, I got through it, but oh my goodness. Oh my
Yeah, you
goodness.
were busy enough that you needed to turn jobs down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
So
is like,
You know what?
it's a good place to be, but also stressful.
Yeah, but I was curious with you feeling and acting like a normal human being. How does that affect your work? Because
I'm
usually
still, I mean,
you're
it's only been a couple days, so
oh,
we're
okay.
gonna find out. This is gonna be a fun science experiment class.
Once the data is arrived.
Yeah, yeah, which I am logging carefully in my little notebook. So we'll see.
Best of luck then for that. I am super interested to see how it goes for you. And it's interesting too, the way that you described your experience so far, because that's actually what we're going to talk about today. So, the conversation topic of the day for our friends that are hanging out is we're going to be talking about the power of words and the way that words shape our reality, not only in our internal world and our thoughts in our life, but in the way that we communicate with one another, in the way that we frame reality for other people. And so, as artists, when we talk about our work or when we communicate with other people, we don't always realize how much control we have over how the other person will conceptualize the information that we're giving them. And I'm going to give a few examples of this during the conversation that I think people will probably relate to immediately because it's something that all of us experience. But if you have been overlooking the power of the words that you use in your communication, but also in the way that you talk to yourself, hopefully this will open up kind of a door to a secret superpower for you because it's almost impossible to fully explain or understand how big of a deal this actually is, because words do shape reality. And I think we'll see examples of that as we have conversations going forward. But to start off with, any of our friends that are in the audience today, if you haven't said hi yet, come on, still say hi. But also, while you're thinking a little bit about this topic, I want you to think about it and maybe share if you've had any experiences where your word choice or the word choice that other people have used in conversations with you have made a huge difference in your understanding of the situation. I have to tell you about a little experience that I had yesterday. So I turned 40 this year, a few days ago, and I had kind of decided that this was going to be my year to stop worrying so much about what other people's conceptions of me were based on the way that I look, and start embracing more of the outward expression of how I feel on the inside. And how do I feel on the inside? Well, I'm relatively short. I'm relatively soft and squishy. I really like food and nature. So I feel like I am like Hobbit life is like the perfect life for me. As you can see, I have rather relatively, aside from some of my witchy stuff, anyway, hobbity decorations. So for my birthday, I asked my husband, instead of getting me a gift, if I could just use whatever money he was going to use for my gift and go shopping and replace a lot of my clothes with hobbity versions of my clothes. The reason this is, Bassam is giggling, the reason that this is a big deal for me is because dressing myself has always been a really difficult emotional task for me. And I was trying to explain this to people, and it doesn't make a lot of sense because I realize my issues are a little bit unique. But I always, I feel like 5 different people living in the same body often. And so when I would buy clothes for myself, I would buy things that I liked with no idea how to put them together into anything cohesive. And so when I would wear clothes, I would still feel like I had no idea who was inhabiting this clothing. And so I decided that this year, and another aspect is, as women guys, fellas, you're going to have to tell me if you identify as masculine. You're going to have to tell me if you experience this. But for the ladies, I think we have experienced this in general. I would feel the pressure to wear things that were flattering, right? Like that didn't make my butt look big, or that made my, thighs look smaller, or whatever. Like all of this pressure for your clothes to look good on your body, rather than for your clothes to be a reflection of who you feel you are. So on my shopping trip, I went and bought a bunch of hobbity things from the thrift store. I'm gonna show you my outfit for today, including, so we know these are my acorn earrings, right? And I have this ring that my hubby got me that is it's a book with a worm. So it is a bookworm ring. This, hang on.
You're so cute.
Make me stand on you.
Are they all new?
You know what? She took her headphones off, so I don't think she can hear it.
Yeah. Are all 4 pieces new?
Yes.
Wow. So you're dressed up for this occasion.
Well, I'm gonna start wearing stuff that makes me feel happy instead of things that stress me out because I don't know if they're right. So I just wanted to share that today because one of my most popular blog posts ever was a blog post about a pair of overalls that I bought myself that are they're also pretty hobbity overalls. But I bought them for myself, and just even the idea of having them made me feel more like me. And so doing this, like leaning into this, and then feeling like at 40, I'm going to remove myself from the pressure for my clothes to make my body look a certain way. And I'm going to choose clothes that make me feel a certain way. So I just wanted to share that because it's making me feel empowered. And maybe other people who feel like they need permission to be able to wear the things that they want to wear to feel the way that they want to feel about themselves. You have permission.
Proud of you.
Erica's with us today. Hi, Erica. All right. So I gave everybody plenty of time to think about this one. So we're going to explain the situation here, what we're talking about with the power of words, particularly in the case of metaphor, but words in general. So Becca, I will ask you to kind of explain this concept for us a little bit using the article that we were referencing earlier, the experiments that they did, and talk a little bit about why words are so powerful and what kind of results they were getting from these experiments. And then we'll talk about how we can use it as artists.
Sure. I can share the article in the group too. I'd have to go pull it up to get the exact specifics. But essentially there was an experiment conducted on, large data pool, describing to people crime in a city. And to some of the participants in the study, crime was described as a beast that was ravaging the city and tearing things apart. And to other members of the study, it was described as a disease that was infecting the city. And depending on how crime was described to the different participants, they responded differently in how they felt the problem needed to be addressed. So for those who it was described as a beast, it was needed to be stopped. It needed to be captured and destroyed or locked away and gotten rid of. For those it was described as a virus or disease, it needed to be treated like a disease. And it's just very, very interesting actual scientific research into how we experience words, even within the same as I stumble over words and forget how to speak, changing the context of how we experience the same situation. And I was thinking about this too, about how I use metaphor in my own life, how I describe things to myself, or potentially how I describe them to my clients, whether it's through something like an artist statement, which I know we've talked about. And I know I've personally expressed that I don't enjoy writing or sharing, or even just when speaking to someone directly about what kind of experience you want them to have when they're working with you, or how you want them to feel when they're experiencing your art, or if they purchase something, whatever it is. I mean, these are all going to shape both our own experience as artist or as person in general. And of course, then for our clients, when we're looking at those business relationships, how they are going to experience working with us.
Uh-oh.
I've disappeared.
She has disappeared. Yes. So this experiment is really fantastic because it gives us actual data on something we have been experiencing for our entire lives. And if everybody will just think about their experience with the news, you will recognize the power of words being used very carefully against you all the time. Depending on what news networks you watch, if there is a discussion going on about abortion, some will call it a baby, some will call it a fetus. That's incredibly purposeful. And it's one of the more powerful examples I can think of because of how polarizing that discussion is. The words that you choose influences the way that people respond, how they feel about that situation. Somebody is likely to be much more protective over a baby as opposed to the idea of a fetus, which doesn't have the same connotations, right? We don't hold and coo and all of those things. So that word use is just something we experience all the time. And if you think about the use of, now the word just deserted me. It's my worst pet peeve ever.
We're on a roll here.
I know. It's, come on. When we use words to influence people in political ways, it's a whole thing. It's gone now. Somebody in the audience knows it. Come on, guys. It starts with a P.
It starts with a P?
Are you
or it has a P in it. Propaganda, yes. Thank you. Gosh. This is the entire purpose of propaganda, right? It's to get somebody, yes, Erica got it as well. Perfect. It's to get somebody to think or believe a certain thing, and the word usage is critical in being able to do that. And even just as an author or a writer, if I were to tell you that I saw a starved dog in the street, you will think one thing about that dog. If I were to tell you I saw a scraggly mutt in the street, you will think another thing about that dog. So those careful, even though we're talking about the same exact thing, the words that somebody uses will not only give you a clue to how they think about whatever it is that they're explaining, but it also influences the way that you respond to it, even if you don't realize it. So I love that study talking about crime, because if something is a disease and that is a plague and it is infectious, how do we treat a disease? We find out what caused it and we go to the root of that thing, and then we stop the root of that thing from causing more problems. If something is a beast, it needs to be killed, it needs to be captured, it needs to be punished, it needs to be right. So there's a whole different response. So I just find that so fascinating. And what I'm wondering now from folks hanging out in the audience, have you thought about this in how you talk to your clients about your art, or even how you talk to yourself about your art? Because if you notice in the beginning, if you were here in the beginning, Becca was comparing herself to a normal person, as if she was not normal, and somewhere out there were people who were normal, but she was not. And even just doing that, even giving ourselves word qualifiers like that, can influence the way that we think about ourselves and how we react to our own thoughts and behaviors and how we treat ourselves. So let us know in the comments. And Dennis, that was quick. The words used to describe an idea or issue frames the debate. Yes, it's also a basic sales tactic. When I sold stereos right after college, the highs would be crisp or shrill, depending on whether I wanted to persuade a customer to buy this or that speaker. That's a fantastic example. What do you guys think? Bassam, Becca, have you ever found yourself doing this? I'm particularly curious in your case, Bassam, like as a coach, as a business coach and things like that. Is that something that you consciously do as part of your practice?
Yeah, actually, if both as a business coach, but also as a photographer, I paid a lot of attention to the words I use with clients. I learned from the best, from all the communities I'm part of. And same thing for coaching. I think when you're one-on-one with somebody and trying to influence their thought process, right? You want to kind of light a fire underneath them. You would use a word that would light a fire underneath them, right? You want them to feel good about themselves. You would kind of turn that word into something that makes them feel good about themselves. If you want to kind of give them a little bit of a push towards one direction, right? You may use a word that would hint that way. So it's interesting that I do that, and I coach in two languages. I coach in English and I coach in French, and my French is quite limited compared to English. So my English is limited because it's my second language. My French is even more limited, right? And I find that my biggest struggle in my coaching when I coach in French is I don't have enough of vocabulary to actually do that as effectively as I do in English, right? So I do live it, but I do want to go back to something I said up front. It's kind of interesting that you're talking about this today, because I mentioned that I read 3 books during the holidays, right? One of the books was called Fascinate. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's about branding. It's by Sally Hogshead, and the premise of the book is that when you develop a successful brand, it's usually because some people find something about it fascinating, right? So she goes through and defines what fascination is and different ways you can fascinate your audience depending on what kind of brand you want to do. And then with each of she calls them the fascination advantages. So she talks about 7 different advantages that you can apply in your business, either individually or as a combination, to fascinate your audience, right? But also within each of those fascination advantages, there are specific words that she gives that actually speak to and support that advantage, right? That you should use in your copy, using your language, using your websites, and so on and so forth, right? So it was actually the kind of the most interesting part of that book, is going through those 7 and going through the words and seeing what they mean and why you would use them. So if anybody is interested in this subject, in terms of developing brand and gaining, I guess, fans, right? That would be a kind of a nice book to look at, right? So just a quick example. For example, one of the seven, if you're interested, the 7 advantages are innovation, passion, power, prestige, trust, mystique, and alert. alertness or alert. And just as one example, the language of creativity would be words such as forward thinking, entrepreneurial, bold, surprising, and visionary, right? And then they talk about each one and how you build it into your branding. So that gives you a bit of an example, right? So I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah, that's my bit for now.
I'm
Yeah, I
curious-
love that.
So in that book, Bassam, I wrote it down so I can remember to go look at that book later. But in that language, was there much weight put into like the use of metaphor or more storytelling kind of creative verbiage, or was it more focusing on those kind of illicit buzzwords in a sense?
Well, no, I mean it was in the context of developing copy and telling a story about. Yes, it was in that context, but the book didn't go specifically into the storytelling or the right. But it was not just here's a list of words you should use. It was
Oh, sure. Yeah.
What context you would use them and what they mean and what kind of what kind of impact they would have on the audience. Yes. Right.
Okay.
Super interesting. I was thinking as you were talking about that, Bassam, I was thinking of how we do that to ourselves, and then the difference between even just the way that we describe ourselves. Like if you were to tell people you were quirky, or if you were to tell people that you were weird, those two things have different connotations, right? And even though I feel like us weirdos are starting to reclaim the word weird, it's still, to other people, that's still an entirely different connotation, as is something like eccentric, right? We have a different set of cues for what that means. And even sometimes just the sound of a word, even if we don't have the proper meaning of the word, even just the sound of it can be really influential, which is so interesting. So what about you, Becca? Because I know a big part of your job, taking commissions, is to be able to speak to your clients in a way that you fully understand each other and you're able to take their ideas and translate those things. But also, like, a lot of those initial consultations are still kind of you selling the process and selling your ability to do the job, right? So what is that like for you? Is that something that you use, or I mean, how does that fit into your business?
I mean, it kind of depends where in the process that is. And also depends on who I am working with. For instance, I did a commission for someone and they described something, their character as a journeyman. And my understanding of what that word meant was very different than their understanding of what that word meant. So we had to go and make revisions to what the character looked like, and I had to ask for specific examples. So it does depend on who the client is. When I'm working with people who write like screenwriters or authors, I tend to slide into that more poetic, kind of flowery prose sort of description of things, because I know they're probably going to get more of a visual experience from words like that than very hyperliteral language, like if I'm working for someone who isn't explicitly an artist of any kind. So it depends who and then where in that process. So we may need to get more and more literal as the process progresses, depending on where we are in drafting. But starting with that more metaphorical, more storytelling approach with most of my clients tends to be where I begin. So we can establish feel, what kind of words make them feel something? What does it tell them in their brain? What do they see in their head? And then moving into the what does that specifically mean in a visual sense. That will tends to come later. Yeah. I have other thoughts, but start there.
Yes. No, I mean, you can feel free to move into the other thoughts. That was just kind of a jumping off point to see, because I know for each of us, like obviously in my case, by the time somebody is getting into my words, they've already recognized that I exist, right? Because my books are the things that I am selling. So if you're getting to a blurb, it means that you are already at least moderately interested in what's happening. And then the blurb is the chance to sell the story. So obviously word choice there is really important, but the entire process for me is surrounded and enveloped and built in words. So my experience of that as an author is very different from my experience of that as a visual artist. So I just wanted to see in your case what that was like, and then jump off into the rest of your thoughts. I'm dying to hear what else is going on in your beautiful head.
Well, things. So it's kind of side tangent, but relating back to that initial study and the considering of metaphor. And I know one thing I've expressed here, even on our little show here, is my relationship with my muse when it comes to inspiration, and like when we've discussed like how do you find inspiration, where do you get ideas, how do you motivate yourself, all those things. I tend to refer to that like as a muse outside of myself. So after kind of considering the power of metaphor here and how I personally am using language in my own head to define things for myself, I've been wondering, how is that impacting my actual ability to go and make art when I have personified the act of creation as this entity outside of me, even though it is, it's in here, it's me, it is, but I have used this language for so many years with myself that it probably is kind of cemented into this functional approach to how I deal with making art and how I deal with inspiration, versus if I had different metaphor to describe that feeling, that desire to be creative, would it be easier to access for me than feeling like it's this personification that I have to wait to visit me. So I'm curious for you guys and for everyone watching right now, if you have used language like that for yourselves, like particularly within even just your own personal artistic process, that impacts perhaps, or have you seen it impact the way that you work?
I love that. Do you have a muse, Bassam? Like, how do you think of your creativity, and do you use any words specifically to think of or describe that to yourself?
Not really. Not really. I'm listening to Becca and trying to kind of relate that to myself, and I'm having a hard time. I'm kind of pragmatic about things, and I don't then tend to delve into this thought process about that.
Do you think more in terms of process and workflow?
Yeah, although I'm not very, it's not that I'm very structured, but I think that way, yes. And I think of how I'm going to engage the client. It's more about that than rather my own approach to art and my own. It's more about the process, not really the the Gantt chart of the process, as much as the journey of the process, the journey that the client's going to go through or that we're going to go through. Whether it's for the whole photo shoot, like the leading up to it and after, whether it's the actual day of, whether it's a specific portion of it. So I think more of along those mini journeys that we're going through. Right?
So it's kind of compartmentalized in each.
Exactly. I tend to compartmentalize things, but it's not in a structured Gantt chart type of way. Right? When you talk about structure and process, it's more of a journey, and related to the experience and the connection that I have with them, and the results that I'm hoping for, and the results being defined by how they react, or how they come out of it, or how they will appreciate it. Right? Not necessarily the results of what does the picture look like. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does.
But I never put words around my approach and how I see things and what my business philosophy is. And I probably do it automatically or intuitively, but I don't really delve into it on that level.
So even just in that explanation and that description, Bassam, I mean, you use the word journey several times there.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a very evocative word when it comes to visualizing something. And I mean, is it technically a metaphor? Kind of, yeah, right?
Yeah.
Well, it is, because it's, what I mean, I always say I offer experiences for my customers, not just a photo shoot. It's not just picture. I offer an experience. And when you relate an experience to other things in life, when you go on a trip, right? It's another words for a trip. It's a journey, right? And you're going to experience something new. And that journey has parts and bits and pieces, and you're expecting things as you go along.
Well, and the word journey kind of also carries with it the connotation of ending that trip being somewhat different than you were at the start, like a journey.
Exactly. You've gained something. You've gained something, and your appreciation of definition of what you've gained is really personal to you, right? And I have a hand in shaping that, but the dosage really is up to them, right? I probably have a consistent way of shaping that, but each person may take more or less out of that same process, right? Depending on their circumstances, their personality, what they're looking for, where they are in their life, how they feel about themselves. Um, but the intent is the same, and the result is the same in different dosages. That's how I see it.
Interesting. Friends
Right.
in the audience, how do you think about your own creativity? And what words do you use to describe that to yourself or even to other people? Are you more in the camp with Becca? Do you think of that as a muse and then what connotations that has? Or do you think of it as process? Or, I mean, there's many obviously different ways for us to think about and describe this to ourselves. The way that I know that the way I experience those bouts of deep work, deep creative work, really falls in line with the Greek idea of ecstasis, right? Of ecstasy, like it's those moments of creative ecstasy. But I never conceptualize my own creativity as related to, like, it's not personified. It's not a muse in my mind. It's not something that just shows up willy-nilly whenever it prefers to because it is its own person. It's absolutely like in my head, it's a superpower. It's just like a thing I can harness and take control of and bring to bear if and when I choose to. And so I know that that absolutely makes a difference in the way that I show up to work because I don't feel like I need to wait for anything. Like I don't need to wait for inspiration to strike, right? I go to work, inspiration will show up, which is kind of the only way I've been able to do what I've been doing so far, which is just writing a lot every single day and continuously like steamrolling forward. Because if I didn't do that, if I didn't look at or think of or describe to myself in my head my job as a job, I wouldn't like show up every day and sit down at the same time and expect to get work done. Does that mean that I'm like always consistent at it? No, because things show up and, you know, we're imperfect. But yeah, that's definitely how I think of it. I think of it as a thing I can do and not as something that is funneled through me. Although the experience of it sometimes does feel that way. Sometimes the experience of creativity feels like you've just opened, like you are the valve and you have opened up and now the universe is pouring through you. But my conception of my attachment to it is definitely my own power. Now, does that mean that I may be less inclined to accept those moments of inspiration as opposed to the way that you work, where in a way that's kind of coming from outside of yourself? And so those moments of inspiration might be, you may be more inclined to chase those down, whereas I may be more inclined to go with my initial plan. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And obviously I can't say that for sure one way or the other because I'm not like, we're not together working and like comparing notes and stuff, but that could be
It's
a
not
difference,
Sony
right?
versus Canon, you know, at the
Oh my God.
5.6.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like both of you actually presented really fantastic examples of just that use of language for yourself. And I'm still kind of like stuck on Bassam's use of journey. And I'm looking of like, what other words could we use and how would that completely change how I'm perceiving Bassam's process? And in your case, Nicole, like, yeah, that you're able to access it. And when I think about it functionally, I do the same thing. I can't just chase the inspiration whenever I want to because responsibility is gross and I have to do things that I don't always want to do right then. But then now I'm considering, you know, if we are to even accept that kind of language that we've internalized and that we use, how can we then make it work for us in places where it does perhaps pose a problem? So like for me, considering I look at my creativity as almost this separate entity unto itself, how can I change my thinking to perhaps invite my muse to come hang out instead of just waiting, love struck and forlorn by the door, you know? Or alternatively for you, like if you if you did want to instantly turn that superpower on, you know, do you metaphorically put on your superpower suit or your superhero suit? Like what are the
Right.
things you can do within that language to work with what we've already internalized?
Ooh, that's so interesting. And I think it also begs the question of, do we want to maintain those
Yes.
metaphors? Like,
Yes.
is that even something we want to keep? And I think for folks in the audience, and I'll be thinking about this as well, but we have to look at the words that we're already using, and if we like the effect that they give us, right? Like, do I like this relationship with this word and the way that it makes me think or feel, and is that something I want to maintain? And the perfect example of this for me is the word nerd, because when I was in high school, nerds were not cool, right? Like, this was not a thing you wanted to tell people that you were. We had not got yet to the phase where everybody was like, nerddom is cool. It was still the time where you were kind of socially outcast, if that's where you were. And I always desired being cool so much. It's like the greatest wish of my heart. And as I got older, I came to appreciate my nerdiness. And now I fly my nerd flag high. It's one of my favorite things about myself. But when I was younger, that word did not serve me. Like, if I would have tried to attach myself to that word, it would have made me feel worse about myself. And so, that was something I had to grow into over time. Is the word that you're using now something that makes you feel more competent, more powerful, stronger, more able, all of that stuff? Or is it a word that makes your connection to whatever it is more difficult? And to be fair, that could completely exist on a spectrum, right? Like, you may absolutely love the relationship to your muse in that when she shows up, it's divine, right? But she can't be counted upon, and she is fickle, and she does what she wants. So there's a kind of dual aspect to your relation to using that word. And then the same thing could be true in my case, or even in your case, Bassam, if there's I'm making an assumption here for the sake of the argument, but if you were not entirely happy with your relation to that word or how it made you think or feel about your process, can we keep aspects of that and then alter it? Or do we need to find a new description, a new metaphor altogether in order to make that relationship better? So Erica said, I feel like my creativity is a process, yet I need to give myself the space for it to happen. Creative exploration, thrifting, brainstorming. I need to create that space for the ideas to come to light. Mm-hmm. And then Bobby saying, hard to articulate in a succinct way, but I don't think of my creativity as a separate thing. It's just a part of me that's kind of always there. But since it's my job as a freelancer and with no family, I'm just able to follow it, which is interesting because then you have obviously a few different connotations in terms of how that word applies to you and your circumstance.
Yeah. Just getting back to what you said, it's you touched on the fact that, as much as you may agree with a certain word being the right word to use, you really have to be comfortable with it yourself. I really appreciate what you said there, and being, for me, it's about being genuine and authentic. And when you talk in front of people, I can't stand not sounding authentic. Coming what I am. This is me. What you see is what you get. And one of the words that I can think of, and it's just as an example, it's probably the silliest thing in the world, but do you call the money people spend on my photo shoots an investment? Right? And I really have a hard time calling it an investment. Mm-hmm. Right? I will not use that word. Now I'll use the word differently. It's an investment in themselves. Right? But the actual money you're giving me and that you're spending on it, it's not really an investment. Right? So a lot of people give that advice. You should call it an investment in your price list, in your talk, in your speech, in your words. And I just can't do that because I don't feel right. I don't feel authentic. I don't feel comfortable, and I'm just not comfortable with it. So that's an example of what you just spoke about.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that that's so important too, is we have to recognize that if we do start changing the words, like you said earlier, Becca, you've internalized a lot of these things over time. And we've talked about the way that the brain works and neurons that fire together, wire together, and things get pretty cemented in your brain after you've been using them over and over again for a long amount of time. And so those words, sometimes we may be so comfortable with them that changing them for something else can seem inauthentic and it can seem like a lie. And oftentimes it takes repeating those things to ourselves, which is the power of propaganda, again, is repetition. Repeating those things over and over to ourselves enough time that they start to feel real. And we can think of that as fake it till you make it. But in fact, it's actually taking advantage of the way that your brain already functions, because repetition is a really powerful tool for retention. So the repetition of those things, which is one of the things I have to do with my anxiety, is recognize my thought patterns, right? And recognize that certain things are wired to go a certain way. And instead of thinking to myself, and I've discovered this, instead of thinking to myself, no, that's not real, there's evidence to the contrary, it's actually much more efficacious for me to say, oh, my brain is just traveling down the path it's used to traveling. I'm used to thinking that something is wrong with me. That's why my brain is doing it. It's not because of evidence or whatever to the contrary. That's just my brain trying to keep me alive. It's going down the path it always goes down. So I don't need to feel a fear response to that thought. That's just my brain stuck in a rut. And so conceptualizing that differently, even though I'm not using any different words, really helps me with that. But it does require sometimes feeling as if you're being dishonest with yourself for a while, until the new thought or the new pattern or the new conceptualization of that word takes hold. If that makes sense.
Sorry, I'm thinking.
That's okay. I'm really curious about what friends in the audience are thinking. So I want you to think also in terms of, or I should say, I would invite you to think in terms of the words that you use to yourself, the words that you use to describe yourself. Do you often think to yourself, well, I'm just slow, or I'm not talented, or I'm just too erratic for that? Like, how often do you use these words to describe yourself? And then how often do you find those things transferring in the way that you speak to other people, particularly as you're trying to grow your art or sell your work? Are you using words that are going to actually show people the passion and the belief that you have in your work? Or are you using words that you think are going to make them more comfortable? You could, if you want, maybe just a little bit, these kinds of wishy-washy, like I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings or make anybody uncomfortable, when in fact what it's doing is communicating your indecision or your lack of confidence. How often do you find these things cropping up for you? Or do you find any patterns that you would be willing to share with everybody and discuss? Because I think adding that to this conversation as an idea of the power of words can probably help a lot of people come to terms with the fact that they do this themselves. Oh, Jean is here. Hi, Jean. We miss you too. Hope your new jobs is good. So hopefully our friends will share their thoughts as far as that goes. And I know, Becca, you mentioned your muse. Is there anything else or any other words you feel like you apply to yourself or your art in either case that maybe are not as helpful? Or maybe you have ones that are really helpful that you'd be willing to share as well, because that
was like the first thing that came to mind, which just kind of spawned my interest, because I feel like that was the most visual sort of metaphor that I use personally. And I'm weirdly, just throughout the course of this conversation and following the comments and stuff, snagging onto every visual cue in everyone's language right now. And I'm finding it very fascinating, per creativity, because that's what we were talking about. It was described as being channeled, or
right.
Or Bobby says that he follows it. And then, Erica needs the space for it, which again is creating this visual of space. Or even Dennis saying that, things need to be framed a certain way, which again, it creates this visual language through words. And I'm just utterly listening to every single sentence everyone's saying right now, and just what is giving me a vision in my head? Because how powerful is that? I mean, how much do we do? I mean, we don't even think about it so much. I'm sure some people think about it, but we're doing so much of it innately, and without that thought, that I feel is almost this untapped superpower.
Oh yeah. It's really interesting. One of the things that writers do as a part of the process is, we go back and we do revisions, and we look at the word choice, and particularly verbs. Verbs are a big one for this, but we go back and we ask ourselves, is this a strong enough word to create the image that I want people to have in their head of what the character is doing? So sprinting is an entirely different feeling to running, which is, you're doing the same thing. It's a different part of things. But if I were to say the sentence, if I were to say, she climbed the fence and ran across the field. She climbed the fence and sprinted across the field. She climbed the fence and pounded across the field. And now pounded might be an unusual like use of the word to describe running. But doesn't pounded have the sense of like feet hitting the ground, like there's force there, right? Sprinted has a feeling of kind of lightness and speed, and running doesn't have nearly as much like motive power behind it as the other two do. And so you can see from an author's perspective why you would maybe use each thing, or different circumstances in which you might use each word. And because authors specialize in this is something that we think of a lot. But you're right, Becca, for the people who are not using words as a big part of their daily life in terms of like, that's my job. We are consuming these and repeating these without recognizing the power that they actually have over our lives. So like if people were to take a day and just write these things down, I think we would be absolutely blown away by the things that influence us all the time, unconsciously, subconsciously. I want unconscious to mean what I want it to mean. I don't want it to mean you're not conscious. I want it to mean the unconscious part of your brain that's still active when you're not using it. It's not what it means, but that's what I want it to mean.
On behalf of the English language, I apologize.
And sometimes
I accept your apology.
And sometimes I can't find those two words, so I say subliminal, but it doesn't mean the same thing.
I like that. I like that too. That actually brings up another really interesting thing. And I know, Becca, I think you've been part of conversations like this before, but something to pay attention to in terms of words. So early last year, anyways, whenever it was last year, I went to Washington State for a job. And I stayed with Kate Woodman, stayed at her house for a little while. And so we got the chance to hang out and chat. And I got into some really fun and interesting conversations with her husband. And we were having relatively high level discussions about, physics and like theory and all of this kind of stuff. And I kept getting the feeling that we were talking past one another. And I realized late into the conversation that I was using words figuratively and he was using words literally. So when I would try to give him examples of what I was thinking of, he was hearing the literal words and translating that in the way that he understood them. And so we were not actually as far off the mark as I thought. We actually were much more in agreement than we were in disagreement, but we were passing each other like ships in the night, right? Like we were saying close to the same thing and just not connecting. And so it's really worthwhile to think about or to ask yourself when you first are having conversations with somebody, particularly your clients, pay attention to how they're using words, like listen more than you speak at first, and then pay attention to the way that they're using words and make sure that your definitions are the same, which is what Becca was talking about earlier when you said, what does that mean to you? That is a really important thing to nail down early on in your conversations, because otherwise you could be using the same words and walking away with different meanings.
That's
not where you want to be.
That's why asking questions is the most powerful thing. Just to clarify, just ask. Whenever somebody makes a statement, just find a question to ask to clarify that statement. And it just kind of goes one level deeper, and you can repeat that as much as you want. And that's very useful in coaching. That's what I do in my coaching, right? Because people come up they're on the spot. They're kind of trying to figure out the situation and they come up with reasons, or they come up with explanations. And you got to ask a question so that they can move on to the next thing. So asking questions is, to me, kind of part of listening, right?
Yeah. And not even just listening, but that active listening that requires understanding, right? It's not just like passively letting information fall into your head. It's that trying to understand it and dissect it, and like all of that active part of listening that's so important. And Erica said, I have conversations like that with my husband every day. And of course, that goes back to our whole, when Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, when that book came out, like that was kind of the idea, right? Was like, we may be using the same words and we are walking away with two different definitions. And it's really important for us to establish that as early on as we can. And I've actually seen some of the best debates I've ever seen. The debaters did that early on and went, okay, so when you use this word, what do you mean by that? And so that way, when they were debating these topics, they actually began with the common ground so that they made sure that they understood what the other person meant, which means that you don't end up arguing a straw man because you're arguing your idea of what they said and not actually what they said. But that's just an example.
I'm curious. So Bassam, I actually wanted to ask, within the realm of coaching, do you find yourself adapting your language depending on your clients? Because I feel like you probably work with a very different sort of spectrum of people than Nicole and I. Do you, alongside asking those clarifying questions, do you find yourself adapting to people's communication style, or is it really all just dependent on listening to your questions?
No, I do adapt. I mean, the type of people I coach, by the way, are all not business. They're all, I guess it's management related coaching, right? So in different types of businesses, a lot of it is manufacturing related. So you see a spectrum of individuals, and if you have to adapt based on the situation they're living. Part of coaching and management is really to understand what they're living day in, day out, the environment they live in, and somebody who's a vice president or a director at a company versus a supervisor managing unionized people on a shop floor of a paper mill. It's two different contexts. It's two different circles of friends and influence and so on that they have, and the way they interact with me and is how I have to adapt to that, right? Because what I'm trying to do is to have them answer all the questions themselves. It's not up to me to answer their questions when I'm coaching, right? Unless they specifically ask. The process of coaching is really to get the person to realize themselves what the answer is to their dilemma or question or so on. So it's really relating. It's always relating to what their style is, what their context is, and what their environment is, to help them figure it out themselves. Right now, if it's they're asking, hey, do you recommend A or B? Obviously I can recommend A or B and give them the answer. But in general, it's trying to get them to the conclusion themselves, right? So you have to do that, right, to facilitate that.
I love how often just listening to people, if you let them talk for long enough, they will give themselves the answer.
That's right.
So as we come towards the end of the hour, super curious if our friends in the audience have had any time, or if you guys have had any insights into ways that you think or ways that you use words. And if you would not mind sharing that, because there's a really great likelihood that somebody out there needs to hear your story. I say this a lot, but oftentimes we have a lock inside of our heart and somebody else's story or their word is the key. And we're not going to be able to unlock that unless we hear what you have to say, because for some reason, the two of us just have a similar enough experience that that's what we need each other. So if you don't mind sharing, would love it if you would do that. And I think it's really funny within my friend group, just the differences in preference for how words are experienced, because I am a lover of poetry. And if I read a good poem, especially if I try to read it out loud to somebody, I will cry. Cannot help it. Waterworks will happen. It just, the sound of the words and the cadence of the words and the meaning of the words and the way everything ties together just will get me. And like trying to read, as I introduce my children to poetry, I start with fun things that they can like. I have 3 boys and they really have all loved Casey at the Bat. If you've never read Casey at the Bat, it's a fantastic, really fun story poem. But as I try to get them into more poetry and I read to them things like, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, give them Maya Angelou, give them Robert Frost, give them Langston Hughes, give them these different poets that I really love. And I will be reading these poems to my children and bawling because I can't handle it. And yet I have deep friends who I love, who we share a lot of the same creative passions, and they absolutely hate poetry. I'm like, how can this be a thing? But it's just fascinating to see the reaction to words and different words. Bobby's saying that's especially important for me doing documentary work, either in film or stills, to build rapport with the subjects and fit it into the environment. That makes so much sense.
I'm curious if that poetry feeling, if it translates beyond just, words on paper.
You might have to explain that to me a little bit more.
Into the way that people communicate. Like if you perhaps do not enjoy reading poetry or hearing poetry, do you have an adverse reaction to people who speak in that way or find these more poetic explanations for things? And of course, not all poetry is dependent on, being flowery in your words. It can be very simplistic, very literal, and depend more on cadence and rhythm and all that. But I'm curious how that translates beyond just what we understand of classical poetry. I'd have to ask the individual, I suppose.
Yeah. I don't know. Because for some of the people, we share a lot of the same creative joys. And I think if you were to listen to the two of us speak, you would be able to absolutely tell us apart. I certainly tend to more creative flourishes in the way that I speak, more to metaphor, more to analogy. And yeah, so that would be really, really interesting. Because to me, my experience of poetry is that it gets beyond the meaning of the words. Deeply beyond the meaning of the words. My brother is a musician. We have often had arguments about words versus music. And it's not the verses as much, but in his mind, music is the way that you communicate the deepest parts of something without categorizing or framing or defining it using a word. And in our conversations, I'm like, yes, except words construct reality. And even in order to say that music does that, you have to use words. Like in order to even communicate that music is capable of doing that to you, you have to use words, unless all you have is music. But even then, thoughts follow experience. And so, we've had these conversations a lot of time, and it's been interesting to get to the point where, at least for me, words are music. Music is words. Words are music. You're talking about still the things that we mentioned earlier, rhythm and cadence and intonation, and all of these things exist. The great orators of all time have had that skill. When to leave silence, when to speak in quick, powerful, when to speak softly, when to bring emotion and, all of these things into it. And that's music. I don't know where I was going with this. It just got really caught up in the idea.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to describe music, the way your brother described that. And I've definitely been moved to tears by straight instrumental music, just the way a note hits, the way it sounds. There's a bunch of psychology behind why music affects us emotionally. But just that relationship, like you're kind of saying, where just the experience of sound, whether it is words or music or the pounding of the feet after you hop the fence. There's something there. I can't put my finger on it, but there is something. I can't find it in the next 30 seconds though.
Well, there is. And there are a lot of different, even if you just think about historically, evolutionarily, connections to certain sounds that we have, to rhythms that are similar to a beating heart when it's relaxed, as opposed to a beating heart when it's running, right? Think about, African drums. If anybody can ever hear African drums and not immediately start getting something happening in their chest, I would be blown away, because there's something so visceral about it. Yeah. It's mathematics too, which is, what makes it so, all of this. I I will fall absolutely down a rabbit hole and drag everybody with me. I'm sorry. So a friend in Facebook land says, Nicole, I love poetry. I love learning new words, and it gets me excited when I discover new ways to express myself through words. Since English is my second language, I have so much respect for anybody who is not only has a strong second language, but also that wants to learn more in poetry and expression and everything. So you absolutely have my more respect. It's Claudia. Yay. Hi, Claudia. Much respect there. I find poetry to be
a second language.
Huh?
Especially English as a second
right.
language.
The grossest language to learn.
It's a totally random story
Yes.
about poetry. I think I may have told you this once, but one of my photo shoots inspired a poem. You interested?
I love that.
Yes.
Interested?
Yes.
You may have told this story, but a friend of mine is a poet, is a writer. She writes, she's published multiple books, poetry. And a few years ago, we did a personal branding photo shoot together. I offered her pictures for her personal branding. And in her early 20s, she had cancer. She had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, very difficult time, very difficult situation, made it beautifully through it. And she has this big scar right here because she was, I guess, operated or intubated or whatever. Just a pretty big, very noticeable scar. So I'm doing the photo shoot and we're looking at the pictures on the computer. And I said, just like casually, I said, like, would you like me to remove your scar? Right? And she looked at me and she went into this, not an angry face, but more of a pensive face. And she said, you know what? I have never thought about that. I have never thought about my relationship with that scar. Absolutely not. I don't want you to remove it. And then she started crying, right? And obviously you can see all the emotions that she went through. And long story short, a couple of weeks later, she called me up. She said, here's a poem I wrote about my relationship with that scar and how you inspired me to write it. I gotta find it. It's been a few years, but I gotta find it. So I thought that was a cute story about poetry.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fantastic example of the way poetry is so often a necessity of deep emotion. Like there are times when you cannot explain yourself in any other way. The only times, so I have written very few poems, but the only times I write them are when they just come to me out of the ether. And I guess that is
me too.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the few times I describe it to myself that way. Because most of the time, if I sit down and I want to do a thing, I do. But poetry seems to be it's like trying to capture a wild horse, right? You have to unicorn it. You have to be pure and show up, with some oats in your hand, and it will come to you if it's going to, and otherwise you're not going to chase it down. And for me, that's just the experience of that, because it's only connected to feeling deeply, feeling beyond words. And because I'm not a musician, I don't have the same access to that language that my brother has, even though I wish I did, and I admire it so much. Oh, okay. Any final thoughts on this idea of the power of words and how we use this daily, or how we could be using it daily in order to make deeper connections, help ourselves, make people connect with our art in a different way, all of that jazz? Any final thoughts? This goes out to the audience as well. If you have any final thoughts, feel free to put those in the comments. But Becca, Bassam, anything from you, any final thoughts or realizations or anything you really want to share before we close for today?
No, just a simple thought that nothing really exists until you put a word around it, right? Nothing exists unless you name it, right? So you have the power of creating whatever you want with the words you use. A chair doesn't exist unless you call it a chair. Somebody called it a chair. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. Sorry, we're getting into something completely. But it's nothing exists until you put a word around it. So just have that freedom to create with words.
With that thought, I would really encourage people, if that inspired you, go learn about Helen Keller's experience when she first began to understand sign language, and what she felt being able to name the things that had no names. when she learned that water was called water. It's heartbreaking and amazing, and definitely gives you a different perception of the power of being able to name something, for sure.
I'm not going to taint that with my babbling.
No, please babble and stop. No, listen, you just did it to yourself, Becca. You just called your thoughts taint. You're tainting things with your thoughts. Stop it.
Yes, tainting Bassam's beautiful and existential and almost nihilist kind of point. I mean,
I must be on drugs too.
yes. Come to the abstract bizarre. No, that's beautiful. And I actually, I don't think I have ever, I don't really know much about Helen Keller, so I'm going to look that up. But yeah, I'm just going to sit with Bassam's thought there. And I mean, the power of names itself is just so interesting too. I mean, the power of words. I almost want to I feel like I want to be more metaphorical in my understanding, even in the struggle or, potentially negative impact of that process. I mean, there's beauty to it. There's so much absolute incredible power to it, just in a both auditory way and in a visual way. So I'm going to be musing and maybe track every word I use all day. That is metaphorical.
I think you just also brought up a really interesting point. You mentioned the fact that words are visual and auditory at the same time. And as visual artists, we often have the power of connecting to one of the strongest of humanity's evolutionary keys, which is our eyes, right? But when you marry your eyes with your ears, this is why cinema is one of the most affecting art forms. And if you've ever seen those videos where they will take music that doesn't belong in a scene and plop it over the scene, that song, this much is true, 80s song. If you pop that over when Voldemort comes back to life and he's looking at Wormtail and he's rubbing his head and stuff, it completely changes the meaning of the scene. And in a big way, that's what words are doing as well. Because this is why every writer is a magician, because you are creating scenes and worlds in somebody else's head using just words. And even the reading of a word has an auditory component in your head if you have an internal narrator. So that's something to think about as well. Bassam, do you hear yourself speak your thoughts inside your head?
No. Hear myself speak my thoughts, and I have to think about that.
So
hear myself speak my thoughts.
Yeah. Here's a kind of example. As I'm going about my day, if you could hear inside my head, if you could see through my eyes, what you would hear and see is, God, that looks really good. I would like to eat that. I can't do it. Why is that mouse so dirty? How is my dog ever going to leave me alone? Oh, there's the dirty window.
So that's what's going on. That's what's going on in your, yeah. So
yes. Also sometimes with music. So yes, I hear myself think those things.
Yeah. Well,
not the same way that I hear you audibly, but the same way when I read a word, I hear my voice reading the word inside my head. I don't just picture, I don't see and understand.
It seems like a dialogue, like actual.
It's a monologue.
Sorry, dialogue. Yeah. Yes, a monologue, as opposed to as opposed to burst of thoughts. Like I have thoughts, right? But not the way you describe it, where you're actually having a monologue.
Yeah, so it still will happen in bursts. Like it's not as if the only time I don't hear myself often is if I'm creating, if I'm climbing. I still might hear myself, but it's a lot less. But while I'm writing, I hear myself saying the words, and then I type the words that I hear and see, the images that come along with those visuals. But yes, so, and sometimes when the bursts happen, it's me speaking over myself, and then the other train dies away. So as you were speaking just now, I was listening to you. I happened to glance up and look at this little guy that I have. His name is Tortish. He clings to one of my cords. You were speaking and I was hearing you speak, and I thought to myself, God, he's so cute. And then immediately switched tracks back to thinking to myself what you were saying and how it applied to me. But I heard myself saying all of the things the whole time.
Yeah. I do have conversation. I do go through conversations with people. Like I'll hear myself going through conversation. That's the thing that comes to mind most, where I actually hear myself actually having the conversation, what it would look like, and using the certain, the right words and the wrong words and whatever, or getting my emotions out and my feelings out and being mad at somebody. And so I hear myself that way, but not in the normal, typical, everyday thought process. I don't hear myself.
So if with those everyday kind of random bursts of thought, are they associated with language for you?
Are they associated with language?
Yeah, like are there words attached to them? If you have a thought, like if you remember, I have to go buy milk at the store.
No, I don't think so. Oh boy, I have to think about it. It's funny. I can't answer your question. I've never noticed. Maybe they do. Maybe they don't.
Interesting.
I'm gonna see. So, are there words attached to those thoughts, or are they thoughts that just,
I think,
subconsciously gets?
Didn't Kate mention before that it's so Kate, I think, doesn't have either, if I remember correctly. I think she said she does not have an internal narrator, and she has aphantasia, meaning so she does not see visual images aligned to her thoughts. So yeah, we'll have to talk to her about that, because she's mentioned it before. We'll have to ask her, but I think she's one of those people that for whatever reason doesn't consciously equate her thoughts into imagery, and she doesn't hear herself say them. I want to say she said it was like the words are there, but she's not hearing them. We have to ask her again and have her explain it. We were having this conversation.
You guys know that condition, the name of that condition? There was a debate a while back online whether everybody, what's normal? Is it normal that you actually vividly see things, imagine things, versus you can barely imagine them?
What's hyperphantasia?
Hyperphantasia. Is that the equivalent of hyperphantasia but from a word perspective? Is that what Kate, what you're talking about?
Yeah, so hyperphantasia would be, so if you think about that as a spectrum, hyperphantasia would be on one side of the spectrum and aphantasia would be on the other side of the spectrum. So if I were to tell you to imagine an apple,
right,
what do you see in your head? And there's usually a spectrum. Right.
And some people say they can actually see that apple vividly as if it's sitting in front of them. That's I guess one end of the spectrum. Whereas I'm looking at my screen, I see you, Becca, and myself on my screen, and I can imagine what an apple looks like, but I don't see it. I don't.
When you say you can imagine what an apple looks like, is it 2D or 3D?
It's black and white, 2D.
It's black. Okay. When I see an apple in my head, I don't just see the apple. I can rotate it and I can see it in context.
Okay, but now that you said that, I could do that if I consciously, like I can actually see it, but I don't see it. I actually can do that mentally, rotate it and imagine a scene where it's actually sitting there rotating close to me.
But you're telling me that you see it in black and white and 2D.
No, but I can see it and I can imagine the color also, but I guess
I don't know. Your initial think of a horse, right? Like just a horse. Whatever the first thing.
There is no color word. There's no color or black. There's nothing associated to it. It's a horse. Like I know what a horse is and I could see it, but it's not unless I specifically think, okay, let me imagine a brown horse versus a black horse.
So the words are what create the vision in your head. So the words you choose to apply are what affect the vision that you get.
Maybe.
And I use words to replicate what I already see.
But you do that instantly, right?
So when I imagine an apple, when I told you to imagine an apple, what popped into my head was a green apple with pale red and white streaks that had some scratches along the side of it and a stem still on.
Happened?
Yeah.
Yeah. See, that doesn't happen to me. I just saw an apple, but then I have to think, okay, I can see a red apple. I can see a green apple if I want to. I can imagine one. Sorry, I can't see it. I can imagine it. I can imagine it close to me rotating. I can imagine it sitting on the counter, but I can't see it.
So
it's not vivid.
I think that that's also a question of word usage. Because when I say see, I don't mean the apple's floating right here and I'm looking at it while I'm looking at you, right? It's just that the picture that's in my imagination is hyper detailed. And of course I can change it because that's the greatness of your imagination. But when the first visual image, the mental image pops up in my imagination, it's highly detailed and it's often in context as well. So it's rarely just something floating in space. It's usually an apple sitting on a wooden countertop next to a bowl of flour and spices. And, like that's how those. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So if your husband says, can you get some apples at the grocery store?
I just saw a bag of Honeycrisp apples.
That's
like
right,
I can see the plastic bag and I can see through the bag.
It's got the little twist tie. Yeah. So it is contextual, right?
Yeah.
Would you like to have apple pie tonight?
I just saw a whole ass apple pie in my head. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like brown crust, bubbles.
Right. So I see the same thing you do, but maybe not to the same level of, I don't see the detail immediately unless I actually think about those details.
Right. Which is the scale, right? So some people won't get the image at all. And some people will get the image hyper detailed. And then most people fall somewhere in between those. And I don't know that it's I don't think it's a question of normal or abnormal. It's just
it's a scale.
Yeah, I think it's just where you happen to fall on the scale affects the way.
Right, but there was an argument online back then that yes, it's a scale, but most people fall on one end of it. Right, and there was a debate which end of it. Right?
Yeah,
and he said, "Dad, can you do this? Because I think I'm not normal." Right? Yeah. But
yeah, Dennis saying his
don't
thoughts
worry,
are noisy
you're
ones.
just like your dad.
Me too, my friend. Me too.
Yeah.
The live ended as I was trying to imagine that app. Oh, yeah. So really, really interesting. The relationship to the way we create the world and the words that we use to describe it. And I would challenge folks, just pick one thing that you feel like you have a pretty good grasp on and try to change the words that you use to describe it. Even if that is, so I'm just going to use this example and then we'll drop off. But my oldest son, when he was little, he had a bully. And this kid, for whatever reason, and the teacher even described it this way, but he really wanted to be near my kid. He kind of liked him. He felt an attachment to him, but he would also be really violent toward him and hit him and just all of these things. And so when we would talk about this kid, we didn't call him a bully when we would describe him to each other. We talked about him like somebody who needed help, somebody who we don't know if they have, a lot of friends, or maybe they have a hard time connecting to people, or the words that we used to describe this person were words of empathy and not words of condemnation. And if you do that to yourself, you will find your relationship to the things that you're describing becomes completely different. And so I would challenge you to pick a thing, whether that's like an irritating neighbor or whether that is another driver on the road, instead of thinking, this entitled asshole, he's trying to get in at the last minute. Change that and think to yourself, what if they're rushing home because their partner is sick and they're panicked? Just change the words toward any one thing and watch the way that it changes the reality, your experience of the reality of that situation. It's kind of an amazing thing. And if you do that for yourself, for your experience of and with yourself, and if you do that for the people that you're communicating about your art with, I think you will find not only do you have infinitely more power to mold the reality of the situation, but you can make yourself a whole lot happier too. Yeah. That is it for today, friends. If you have anything you would like to discuss on the Artist Forge, put that in the comments section, put it in the Facebook group, let us know so we can drag that with us into next week, where we will have more artsy-fartsy conversations. And in the meantime, until next Monday at 1 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, that is noon for the West Coast and 3 p.m. for the East Coast, go make something amazing. Have a fantastic week, and we will see everybody then.
Bye. Bye.